The morning of May 11th, 1945, radar Picket Station, 15, 60 miles northwest of Okinawa. Commander Baron Mullaney stood on the bridge of the USS Hugh W, Hadley, watching the horizon where sea met sky in a line that had swallowed too many ships already. His destroyer, barely 6 months old, carried 336 souls and enough firepower to make any kamikaze pilot think twice. But thinking twice was no longer part of Japanese doctrine. At 7:55, the radar screens lit up like a Christmas display. Not one contact, not 5. 150 Japanese aircraft, streaming south from Kyushu airfields with a singular purpose. 12 Marine Corsair fighters rose to meet them, their engines screaming defiance against impossible odds. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The mathematics were brutal. 12 fighters against 150 attackers, 2 destroyers against waves of pilots who had already written their final letters home. What those Japanese pilots didn't know, what their intelligence officers couldn't have known, was that the shells being loaded into the Hadley's 5-inch guns carried a secret that had already changed the course of the war. 3 inches of precisely engineered aluminum and copper that contained more miniaturized electronics than most radios of the era, a device so revolutionary that it had been guarded as carefully as the atomic bomb itself, the proximity fuse. And over the next 95 minutes, those 3-inch packages of American ingenuity would write a record that still stands in naval history. But the story of how that technology came to save Commander Mullaney's ship begins not in the Pacific, but in a laboratory in Washington, D.C., where a physicist named Fuze stared at a problem that aviation experts worldwide had declared unsolvable. August 1940. The Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, Carnegie Institution, Washington. Fuze's office looked less like a physicist's workspace and more like a graveyard for failed prototypes. Vacuum tubes, their glass housings shattered from impact tests. Circuit boards twisted into shapes that suggested violent death. Resistors and capacitors scattered across workbenches like casualties from some miniature war. The problem was simple to state, impossible to solve. Aircraft had become too fast, too maneuverable for conventional anti-aircraft fire. Gunners firing timed fuses had to predict exactly where a plane traveling at 300 miles per hour would be several seconds in the future, then set each shell's detonation timer accordingly. The statistics were damning. In the early phases of the war, it took approximately 2,500 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition to bring down a single enemy aircraft. Some estimates ranged as high as 20,000 rounds per kill. The British had conceived the solution. A shell that could sense when it passed near an aircraft and detonate automatically, turning near misses into kills. Conception and execution stood oceans apart. To work, such a device would need to survive forces that would liquefy human tissue. 20,000 times the force of gravity in a fraction of a second as the shell accelerated from 0 to 2,800 feet per second inside the gun barrel. Then 25,000 revolutions per minute as the barrel's rifling set the shell spinning like a gyroscope from hell. Every vacuum tube of the era would shatter instantly. Every connection would tear apart. Every circuit would fail. German engineers had declared the concept theoretically sound but practically impossible. Japanese researchers had explored the idea and abandoned it as technically unfeasible. Even British scientists, who had originated the concept, weren't certain it could be done with shells. Rockets, perhaps. Shells, never. Fuze sat at his desk, surrounded by the wreckage of 6 months of failure, and made a decision that would alter the trajectory of naval warfare, forever. If conventional vacuum tubes couldn't survive the forces involved, then they would build unconventional ones. If standard circuits shattered, then they would design circuits that treated violence as a feature, not a bug. If the laws of physics said it couldn't be done, then they would rewrite the laws. The National Defense Research Committee had given Section T of the Applied Physics Laboratory one mandate: develop a working proximity fuse for 5-inch naval guns. The Navy was particularly insistent because their ships were uniquely vulnerable to air attack, and the Pacific War would be won or lost based on whether American vessels could survive concentrated aerial assault. The team that Fuze assembled at Johns Hopkins University read like a roster of America's finest minds: physicists who had pioneered radio technology, engineers who understood materials science at the molecular level, mathematicians who could model ballistic trajectories while accounting for factors that most people had never considered. By January 1945, 10,000 people across 112 factories would be involved in producing what sailors would call the funny fuse. But in August 1940, it was just Fuze and a handful of researchers staring at components spread across laboratory benches, trying to miniaturize an entire radio station into a package smaller than a coffee can that could survive forces that would turn steel into fragments. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. They couldn't make conventional vacuum tubes stronger, so they made them smaller. Miniaturization reduced the mass of each component, which reduced the inertial forces during acceleration. What couldn't survive as a full-size tube might endure as a miniature. The tiny hearing aid tubes that Western Electric and Raytheon were producing became the foundation. Each tube was then cushioned in wax and dielectric oil that absorbed and distributed the shock of firing. The circuit design was elegant in its simplicity. A miniature transmitter sent out a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced back from a nearby aircraft, the returning waves interfered with the outgoing transmission, creating a frequency shift. When that shift reached a predetermined threshold, indicating the target was close enough, a capacitor discharged into a bridge wire no thicker than a human hair. The bridge wire exploded, igniting a small charge that detonated the main explosive. The entire system had to fit inside a shell nose that was only 5 inches in diameter. It had to activate automatically after firing, preventing premature detonation that would kill the gun crew. It had to wait 0.7 seconds before arming, by which time the shell would be thousands of feet from the ship. It had to remain stable through atmospheric buffeting at supersonic speeds, and it had to distinguish between an aircraft at lethal range and spurious signals from seabirds, waves, or electromagnetic interference. Most critically, it had to be cheap enough and reliable enough to produce by the millions, because naval warfare consumed ammunition at rates that would bankrupt any economy that couldn't achieve mass production. By January 1942, Section T had produced a working prototype. The testing began at the Army's Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, where 15,000 bombs would be dropped. At Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, where nearly 50,000 test firings would validate performance across temperature extremes and altitude variations. At facilities in North Carolina and along the Chesapeake Bay, where researchers measured blast patterns against full-scale aircraft targets, the reliability rate was marginal, 52% success against a water target in the first major trial. The Navy accepted that failure rate because even a 52% success rate represented a revolution in anti-aircraft capability. Timed fuses were working perhaps 5% of the time under optimal conditions. A proximity fuse that worked half the time was still 10 times more effective than the alternative. Captain William Spike Blandy, head of the Bureau of Ordnance Research Desk, ordered immediate production in January 1942. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, manufacturer of automobile components and radios, received contracts to produce proximity fuzzes at industrial scale. RCA, Eastman Kodak, Sylvania Electric, and dozens of other companies retooled their assembly lines. Workers, many of them women, assembled the delicate components by hand under conditions of absolute secrecy. Most never knew what they were building. The security classification was higher than most military secrets. The Fuze program was guarded as carefully as the Manhattan Project or the D-Day invasion plans. Workers were searched when entering and leaving the factories. Police and fire departments were barred from departing the buildings. The very existence of the proximity fuse remained classified throughout the entire war. The reason for this paranoia was simple. If a single intact fuse fell into enemy hands, Japanese or German engineers might be able to reverse engineer the technology, develop countermeasures, or create their own versions. The weapon's effectiveness depended entirely on the enemy, not understanding why American anti-aircraft fire had suddenly become so devastatingly accurate. To prevent capture, the Fuzes were initially restricted to naval use over open ocean, where any dud would sink into deep water beyond recovery. The designation Variable Time Fuse, or VT Fuse, was deliberately misleading, suggesting an improved timed fuse rather than a revolutionary radio-guided system. But all the secrecy and all the engineering brilliance meant nothing until the weapon proved itself in combat. That proof would come in the pre-dawn darkness of January 5, 1943, when a light cruiser named Helena faced 4 Japanese dive bombers off the coast of Guadalcanal. USS Helena, light cruiser CL-50, cruised through dark waters south of Guadalcanal, returning from a bombardment mission against Japanese positions at Munda. The ship's company had been at battle stations for hours, the kind of exhausting vigilance that made men see shadows and hear engine sounds that weren't there. Lieutenant Red Cochran commanded the aft 5-inch battery, a dozen guns capable of throwing 55-pound shells 20,000 yards into the sky. At 0600 hours, 4 shapes materialized from the clouds. Aichi D-3, a dive bombers, obsolete aircraft that the Allies had designated VAL. Slow, predictable, but flown by pilots who had been practicing their craft since the war's beginning. One scored a hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before the formation broke off its attack. As the 4 bombers climbed away, thinking themselves safe at distance, Cochran's battery opened fire. 3 salvos, 6 shells. The engagement lasted perhaps 15 seconds. The second salvo caught one of the retreating VALs, but the shell didn't strike the aircraft directly. It exploded 20 feet away, close enough that the blast wave shattered the aircraft's control surfaces and the shrapnel shredded the fuel tanks. The VAL disintegrated in mid-air, pieces of aluminum and steel and human being raining into the Pacific. The gunnery report that night was succinct and enthusiastic. The value of the Mark 32 fuzzed projectile cannot be too highly stressed. Commander William Parsons, the ordnance officer who had personally delivered the first 5,000 proximity-fuzzed shells to the Pacific Fleet and who was aboard Helena that morning, sent an immediate dispatch to the Bureau of Ordnance. The weapon works as designed under combat conditions. What had just occurred, though no one aboard Helena fully understood it yet, was a demonstration that would transform naval warfare. For the first time in history, anti-aircraft fire had become accurate enough to defeat mass aerial attack. The implications rippled through the Pacific Fleet within weeks. By the end of 1943, proximity-fuzzed shells accounted for more than half of all Japanese aircraft shot down by naval gunfire, despite representing only 25% of ammunition expended. The effectiveness ratio was 3-to-1 compared to timed fuses. At night, when visual tracking was nearly impossible, the ratio jumped to 370% improvement. The lethal fragment pattern explained the dramatic increase. A standard timed fuse created a kill radius of approximately 60 square feet. The proximity fuse, because it detonated at optimal distance from the target, generated a lethal fragment pattern of 3,000 square feet, the difference between threading a needle and hitting the broadside of a barn. But the true test of the proximity fuse would come not in the wide expanses of the Central Pacific, where American carriers had air superiority and distance provided some protection. The test would come in the spring of 1945, when American forces invaded Okinawa, 340 miles from the Japanese home islands, within easy range of every aircraft that Japan could still scrape together for one final desperate defense. Admiral Matome Ugaki, commander of the 5th Air Fleet, had a plan that Japanese military planners believed could turn the tide of the war. Operation Tengo, the floating chrysanthemum. Mass kamikaze attacks that would inflict such catastrophic losses on the American fleet that the invasion of Okinawa would have to be abandoned. Without Okinawa, there could be no invasion of the Japanese home islands. Without invasion, perhaps terms could be negotiated that were better than unconditional surrender. The mathematics were straightforward. Conventional bombing and torpedo attacks were achieving hit rates in the single digits. Too many Japanese pilots lost, too much time for American combat air patrol to intercept, too much opportunity for defensive maneuvering. But a pilot who committed himself to crashing into a target, who treated his aircraft as a guided missile and himself as expendable guidance system, dramatically increased the probability of a hit. Kamikaze attacks achieved success rates exceeding 34%. 1 in 3 suicide aircraft was hitting its target. The strategic calculus was cold but rational. Trade a pilot and an obsolete aircraft for a destroyer, or better yet, a carrier. Trade 10 pilots for a battleship. Trade 100 for enough damage that the American advance would stall. Japan assembled every aircraft that could still fly. First-line fighters, obsolete biplanes that had been built in the 1920s. Trainers with inexperienced pilots who could barely navigate, let alone conduct complex attack profiles. It didn't matter. The tactics were simple. Point the aircraft at an American ship. Push the throttle forward. Aim for the largest target available. The Emperor would remember their sacrifice. To provide early warning of these massed attacks, the U.S. Navy established 16 radar picket stations around Okinawa. Destroyers positioned 40 to 60 miles from the main fleet, equipped with the latest search radar and fighter direction equipment. Their job was to detect incoming Japanese formations, vector combat air patrol to intercept them, and serve as the first line of defense. The sailors called it the graveyard shift, because on radar picket duty, you were the most exposed, most vulnerable, most likely to be attacked ship in the entire fleet. You saw the enemy first, which meant the enemy saw you first. You were alone, or nearly so, miles from supporting vessels, surrounded by ocean and hostility. And when the kamikazes came, you couldn't run, you couldn't hide, you could only fight, with every gun you had, until either they were all dead or you were. Between April and June 1945, the Battle of Okinawa would consume 21 American ships sunk and 66 damaged, 2/3 of them destroyers on picket duty. 4,900 U.S. Navy personnel would die. The Navy would suffer more casualties at Okinawa than in any other single campaign in its history, and in the middle of that maelstrom, on the morning of May 11th, 1945, Commander Mullaney's USS Hugh W. Hadley would face approximately 150 Japanese aircraft determined to send his ship and every soul aboard her to the bottom of the East China Sea. The technology that would save them had been invented in a Washington laboratory 5 years earlier by a physicist who believed that numbers could defeat assumptions. But technology alone never won battles. Ships didn't fight. Guns didn't fire themselves. In the end, men would save the Hugh W. Hadley. Men and the 3-inch packages of miniaturized electronics that gave those men a fighting chance against impossible odds. 7:55. Radar Picket Station 15. The Combat Information Center aboard USS Hugh W. Hadley erupted with contact reports. Not the single blips that had harassed the fleet for weeks. A wall of contacts. 150 aircraft streaming south from Kyushu, their formations tight and purposeful. Kikusui No. 6, the 6th mass kamikaze assault. Commander Mullaney's voice crackled across the ship's communication system. All hands, general quarters. This is not a drill. All guns, load proximity-fused ammunition. Combat air patrol. This is Hadley. We have multiple bogies inbound, bearing 015, range 60 miles and closing. 12 Marine Corsair fighters clawed for altitude, their engines screaming against physics and time. 12 fighters against 150 attackers. The mathematics were impossible, but the Marines weren't alone. Below them, 2 destroyers prepared to demonstrate what American industrial might and scientific ingenuity could accomplish when survival demanded impossible solutions. The Hadley's 6 5-inch guns swung toward the threat. Loaders lifted 55-pound shells, each one containing the miniaturized miracle that Merle Tuve's team had created in a Washington laboratory 3 years earlier, the proximity fuse that Admiral Nimitz had called essential to victory. the technology that Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal credited with blazing the trail to Japan. At 7:57, the first wave of Japanese aircraft broke through the cloud cover. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, their fixed landing gear making them look like predatory birds. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers, obsolete but deadly when flown by men who had already written their farewell letters. Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters, stripped of everything except bombs and enough fuel for a one-way trip. The Marines hit them first, 30 miles out. Corsairs dove through the Japanese formation, their 50 caliber machine guns tearing wings from fuselages and pilots from cockpits. But there were too many. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. For every Japanese aircraft that exploded or spiraled into the sea, 3 more pressed forward. The kamikaze pilots had been trained for exactly this moment. Fly through the fighters, find the ships, dive until impact or death. The Hadley's radar tracked the survivors. 80 aircraft, 70, 60 still boring in with the single-minded determination of men who believed their deaths would save their nation. At 12 miles, the destroyer's 5-inch guns opened fire. The sound was like the world ending, a continuous roar that made speech impossible and thought difficult. Every 3 seconds, another shell screaming into the sky at 2,800 feet per second. But these weren't the timed fuses that had frustrated anti-aircraft gunners since the war's beginning. Each shell carried a miniature radio transmitter, no larger than a cigarette pack. As the shell climbed toward the attacking aircraft, that transmitter sent out a continuous signal, 180 to 220 megahertz, radio waves traveling at the speed of light. When those waves struck an aircraft and bounced back, the frequency shifted. The Doppler effect, the same phenomenon that makes a train whistle change pitch as it passes. When the frequency shift reached a predetermined threshold, indicating the target was within lethal distance, a capacitor discharged. The bridge wire exploded. The detonator fired. The main charge transformed the shell into 3,000 square feet of steel fragments, traveling at supersonic speed. A Val approaching from the starboard quarter disappeared in a black flower of smoke and debris at 2,000 yards. The pilot never saw the shell that killed him. The proximity fuse had detonated 30 feet away, close enough that the blast wave shattered his cockpit and the shrapnel shredded his aircraft's control surfaces. The Val tumbled into the ocean, leaving only an oil slick to mark where a young man had died, believing his sacrifice mattered. 8:35. The Hadley had been firing continuously for 38 minutes. 801 rounds of 5-inch ammunition. 8,950 rounds of 40 mm, 5,990 rounds of 20 mm. The barrels glowed red. The gun crews worked with mechanical efficiency, born of training and terror. Load, fire, load, fire, the rhythm of survival. In those 38 minutes, the Hadley's gunners shot down 12 Japanese aircraft. The destroyer USS Evans, fighting alongside them, accounted for 15 more. The Combat Air Patrol, now reinforced by additional Marine fighters vectored in from Okinawa, splashed another 30. But the mathematics remained impossible. 150 attackers, 57 destroyed before they reached attack range. 93 still coming. 93 pilots who had accepted death and now sought only to take Americans with them. The proximity phases performed exactly as designed, better than designed. The effectiveness ratio that had been 3-1 in 1943 had climbed to 6-1 by 1945. Every proximity-fused shell was 6 times more likely to destroy an aircraft than the timed fuses it replaced. But even a miracle weapon couldn't overcome numbers. The Japanese had learned this lesson over 2 years of fighting American anti-aircraft fire that grew more lethal with each passing month. Normal attack profiles no longer worked. Conventional bombing and torpedo runs gave American gunners too much time to track and destroy incoming aircraft. The only tactic that still achieved results was the one that terrified American sailors more than anything else in the Pacific War: kamikaze. The divine wind. Attack profiles that treated aircraft as guided missiles and pilots as expendable guidance systems. No evasion, no escape, just dive until impact turned pilot and plane and bomb into a single weapon of mass murder. At 8:40, the formations dissolved into individual attacks from every direction simultaneously. 4 kamikazes from the starboard bow, 4 from the port bow, 2 from astern. 10 aircraft, 10 pilots who had trained for this moment their entire abbreviated careers. They came low, using the ocean's surface to mask their approach until the last possible moment. Then up, climbing into firing range of the Hadley's guns. The 5-inch batteries swung with mechanical precision, radar directed, fire control computers calculating lead angles and fuse settings. The kind of integrated weapons system that made American warships the most lethal anti-aircraft platforms in naval history. The port battery caught the first Kate at 800 yards. The proximity fuse detonated 25 feet above and ahead of the aircraft. The blast wave drove the bomber down into the ocean with such force that the impact created a geyser 40 feet high. The starboard battery destroyed 3 valves in succession. Each detonation appeared as a black puffball in the sky. Each puffball marked where a Japanese pilot's last thoughts had been interrupted by steel fragments traveling faster than sound. The 40mm guns engaged the closer targets. These weapons couldn't fire proximity-fused ammunition. The shells were too small to contain the miniaturized electronics, but they could throw up a wall of lead that turned the air itself into a killing zone. A Zero attempting to dive on the bridge disintegrated under concentrated 40mm fire. Pieces of aluminum and pilot rained across the forward deck. Another Zero, its engine already smoking from proximity fuse damage, clipped the forward mast with its wing and cartwheeled into the sea 50 yards to port. The gunnery performance was extraordinary. In those few minutes of coordinated defense, the Hadley's crew shot down all 10 attacking aircraft. Not one reached the ship. Not one bomb struck home. It was the kind of perfect defensive action that naval tacticians would study for decades afterward. The kind of performance that made the proximity fuse seem like the ultimate answer to the kamikaze threat. Then, their luck ran out. At 9:20, a damaged Kate trailing smoke and fire made its final approach from astern. The aftergun mount tracked it, fired. The proximity-fused shell detonated perfectly. 30 feet from the target, the Kate should have disintegrated. Its pilot should have died instantly. Instead, the shrapnel severed the aircraft's tail but left the engine and bomb intact. The Kate, no longer controllable, tumbled forward with the momentum of its final dive. It struck Mount 44, the afterport 40mm gun position, diving directly down the barrels. The bomb detonated on impact. Mount Captain Nicholas's last words, broadcast across the ship's intercom seconds before impact, were captured. By the communications log, "We'll get the S.O.B." Then the explosion. 8 men died instantly. The mount ceased to exist. In its place, a crater in the deck and fires that spread with terrible speed toward the ammunition magazines below. Almost simultaneously, another kamikaze hit the starboard side at the waterline. The aircraft's fuselage punched through the hull plating like a bullet through paper. The bomb carried through the breach and detonated beneath the keel. The explosion lifted the 2,200-ton destroyer completely out of the water. For 20 seconds, the Hadley vibrated with such violence that men below decks thought the entire ship was breaking apart. The 3 after-engineering spaces flooded immediately. The destroyer lost all power, dead in the water, settling by the stern, taking on a 5-degree list that grew steeper with each passing minute. A third kamikaze dove through the space between the foremast and afterstack, so close that it clipped communication wires and antenna. The proximity fuses had done their job, damaging the aircraft enough that the pilot couldn't control his final approach. The Zero missed the ship by 10 feet and impacted the ocean to starboard, its bomb detonating underwater with a concussion that buckled hull plates. But the Hadley was finished as a fighting unit. No power, no steerage, fires raging amidships, the fantail awash, the torpedo warheads in the after-tubes at risk of cooking off and blowing the stern completely away. Commander Mullaney gave the order that no captain wants to give. All hands not engaged in damage control. Prepare to abandon ship. 286 men went over the side into life rafts. 50 officers and sailors remained aboard, fighting fires and flooding, trying to save a ship that every calculation said couldn't be saved. The Japanese attacks continued. But now the Combat Air Patrol, reinforced and fully engaged, created a defensive barrier that no kamikaze could penetrate. Marine Corsairs shot down wave after wave. One Marine pilot, having expended all his ammunition, deliberately flew into a Japanese bomber's tail section, using his propeller to destroy the enemy's control surfaces. The Japanese aircraft spun into the ocean. The Corsair, its propeller damaged but engine still running, limped back to Okinawa with a story that would become legend. By 9:40, the attack was over. 150 Japanese aircraft had participated in Kyushu No. 6. 93 had been destroyed by the combined efforts of the Hugh W. Hadley, the USS Evans, and the Marine Combat Air Patrol. 57 additional aircraft had been shot down by other ships and fighters around Okinawa. Every single aircraft committed to the attack had been destroyed. Not one returned to Kyushu. Not one pilot survived to describe what they'd encountered. The cost to the Americans was severe but not catastrophic. The Evans had been hit 4 times and was effectively destroyed, though her hull remained afloat. The Hadley, struck 3 times, lay dead in the water, with 30 men killed and 67 wounded. But both ships remained afloat. Both could be saved. And in the calculus of naval warfare, where carrier battles decided the outcome of the Pacific War, the survival of 2 destroyers, after facing 150 kamikazes, represented something close to a miracle. The miracle had a name: 22 million proximity fuzzes, manufactured in 112 factories across America, each containing approximately 130 miniaturized electronic components, each costing $18 in 1945, down from $732 in 1942. Mass production at a scale that only American industry could achieve. The statistical analysis conducted after the war revealed the full magnitude of what the proximity fuse had accomplished. Between October 1944 and August 1945, U.S. Navy anti-aircraft guns fired proximity-fused ammunition against kamikaze attacks off Okinawa. The effectiveness numbers were staggering. Where conventional timed fuses required approximately 1,000 rounds to destroy a single aircraft, proximity fuses achieved kills with an average of 250 rounds, 4 times more effective. Against kamikazes attacking at close range and high speed, the improvement was even more dramatic. Night-kill ratios improved by 370%. The proximity fuse didn't just make anti-aircraft fire more effective, it made it effective enough to matter. Admiral Arleigh Burke, who commanded destroyers in the Solomon Islands campaign, wrote, after the war, that mechanical time fuses brought down aircraft by accident more than design. They were good for harassing enemy aircraft, but not much else. The proximity fuse changed everything. For the first time in naval history, ships without air cover could defend themselves against concentrated aerial attack. That capability proved essential at Okinawa, where American forces operated within range of every aircraft Japan could still field. Between April and June 1945, kamikaze attacks sank 21 American ships and damaged 66 more. Most were destroyers on radar picket duty. 4,900 U.S. Navy personnel died. The carnage was unprecedented, but without the proximity fuse, the losses would have been catastrophically higher. Naval analysts estimated that proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire prevented approximately 15,000 additional Allied ship losses through improved climb interception, higher service sealing operations, and feathering capability after engine damage, and extended range that reduced forced landings. Every ship saved was a victory multiplied across every future engagement. Every crew that survived could fight again. The proximity fuse didn't win the Pacific War, but it made victory possible at a cost America could sustain. The technology that saved the Hugh W. Hadley had been invented by a physicist who believed numbers could defeat assumptions. Merle Tuve, standing in his Washington laboratory in 1940, staring at vacuum tubes that shattered under forces no peacetime engineer had to consider. Tuve, who decided that if conventional components couldn't survive, they would design components that treated violence as a feature rather than a bug. His team at the Applied Physics Laboratory had accomplished something that German and Japanese engineers declared impossible. They miniaturized an entire radio station into a package smaller than a coffee can. They made it survive 20,000 times the force of gravity. They made it reliable enough to produce by the millions, and they kept it secret through the entire war. Japanese military leaders knew American anti-aircraft fire had become devastatingly effective. They could see the results in aircraft loss rates that climbed from manageable to catastrophic, but they never understood why. German officers, interrogated after the war, expressed shock when told about the proximity fuse. They had assumed American gunnery superiority came from better radar fire control, not from revolutionary fuse technology. The Japanese had actually developed their own proximity fuse, a photoelectric design that worked in dropped bombs. They deployed it exactly once, too late in the war to matter, against an enemy that already possessed superior technology. The USS Hugh W. Hadley never fought again. Towed to Iishima, then to Kiramaretto, then to Buckner Bay, the destroyer underwent temporary repairs that kept her afloat but couldn't restore her to combat effectiveness. On September 26, 1945, she arrived at Hunters Point, California, after a 6,100-mile tow across the Pacific. The Navy declared her too damaged to repair. She was decommissioned on December 15, 1945, and sold for scrap in September 1947. But her Presidential Unit Citation, awarded for extraordinary heroism during the action at Radar Picket Station 15, recognized what her crew had accomplished. 23 aircraft shot down in 95 minutes, more than any other ship in a single engagement in the entire history of naval warfare, an all-time record that still stands. The men who fought that battle carried the memory for the rest of their lives. Some talked about it freely, others kept silent, unable to find words for the particular terror of standing on a steel deck while suicide pilots dove from the sky. All of them knew they'd survived because American industry and American science had given them weapons that worked when survival depended on effectiveness, measured in milliseconds and feet. The proximity fuse represented everything that made American military power decisive in World War II, not just technological superiority, though that mattered. Not just industrial capacity, though mass production was essential. What made the difference was the integration of science, engineering, manufacturing, and operations into a system that could identify problems, develop solutions, produce them at scale, and deploy them where they mattered most. That system began with Tuve and his team at the Applied Physics Laboratory, working 18-hour days to create something that experts said couldn't be done. It continued through factories where women assembled delicate components by hand, never knowing what they were building but understanding it was important. It manifested in test facilities, where researchers subjected prototypes to forces that destroyed them repeatedly until failure modes were understood and eliminated. And it culminated aboard ships like the Hugh W. Hadley, where sailors loaded proximity-fused shells and gunners fired them with the certainty that the weapon in their hands would work when their lives depended on it. The proximity fuse remained classified until November 1945, when the Applied Physics Laboratory finally released the story to the public. Newspapers across America ran headlines about the secret weapon that had helped win the war. The coverage focused on the drama of miniaturization and the engineering challenges overcome. But the real story was simpler and more profound. A group of Americans, faced with a problem that threatened their nation's survival, refused to accept that the problem was unsolvable. They tried, they failed, they learned from failure, they tried again, and eventually they created something that changed the course of history. Winston Churchill, in a letter to President Roosevelt, called the proximity fuse one of the most original and effective military developments of World War II. General George Patton, after using proximity-fused artillery during the Battle of the Bulge, said the funny fuse won the battle and would revolutionize warfare. Admiral William Halsey credited proximity fuses with saving the fast carrier task forces from losses that would have been enormously larger without them. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal said the proximity fuse blazed the trail to Japan and made the westward push possible at acceptable cost. They were all correct. But perhaps the most important testimony came from the men who fought aboard ships like the Hugh W. Hadley. Sailors who stood on radar picket stations 40 miles from the nearest friendly vessel, watching radar screens fill with contacts that represented young men flying to their deaths. Gunners who loaded shells and fired at targets they could barely see, trusting that American technology would compensate for human limitation. Damage control parties who fought fires and flooding, knowing that survival depended on keeping their ship afloat long enough for help to arrive. They didn't talk about technology or engineering or scientific achievement. They talked about the moment when a kamikaze dissolved in mid-air 50 yards from the bridge, destroyed by a shell that exploded at exactly the right distance to turn near-miss into kill. They talked about going home to families they'd feared they'd never see again. They talked about friends who didn't make it, but might have if the proximity fuse had been deployed earlier in the war. The Battle of Okinawa ended on June 22, 1945. The island was declared secure, though fighting continued in isolated pockets for weeks afterward. The cost had been staggering: 12,520 Americans killed, 38,000 wounded, 107,000 Japanese soldiers dead, 150,000 Okinawan civilians killed in the crossfire. At sea, the Navy suffered losses that exceeded any other campaign in its history. But the kamikazes had failed. Despite sinking or damaging 87 ships, despite killing nearly 5,000 sailors, despite employing tactics that achieved hit rates exceeding 34%, the divine wind hadn't turned the tide. American ships, equipped with radar, combat information centers, coordinated fighter direction, and proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, had proven they could survive and continue fighting even against waves of suicide attackers. That capability made the invasion of Japan theoretically possible. Without it, the projected casualties for Olympic and Coronet, the planned invasions of Kyushu and Honshu, might have been high enough to force negotiation rather than unconditional surrender. The atomic bombs made invasion unnecessary, but the proximity fuse had made invasion survivable. In the end, that may have been its greatest contribution. Not the aircraft destroyed or the ship saved, but the strategic option it preserved for American planners who needed Japan to understand that resistance was futile. Commander Baron Mullaney received the Navy Cross for his leadership during the action at Radar Picket Station 15. His citation noted that he remained on the bridge throughout the engagement, directing fire and damage control, while his ship absorbed multiple kamikaze hits. When the order came to abandon ship, he stayed aboard with the skeleton crew that saved the Hadley from sinking. The destroyer's executive officer received the Silver Star. 20 additional crew members received Bronze Stars or Letters of Commendation. The Hadley herself received the Presidential Unit Citation, one of only a few dozen destroyers so honored during the entire war. Merle Tuve never received a medal. He continued as director of the Applied Physics Laboratory until 1946, then returned to the Carnegie Institution's Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, where he'd begun his career. He died in 1982, honored by the scientific community but largely unknown to the public. The proximity fuse lived on in weapons systems that defined the Cold War and beyond. Principal Tuve's team pioneered, using radio waves to sense target proximity and trigger detonation at optimal distance, evolved into increasingly sophisticated guidance systems: the Phoenix AIM-54 air-to-air missile, the Standard surface-to-air missile, the Patriot missile that defended against Iraqi Scuds during the Gulf War. Every modern air defense system traces its lineage back to the 3-inch aluminum cylinder that saved the Hugh W. Hadley on a May morning in 1945. But perhaps the most important legacy isn't technological. It's the demonstration that impossible problems can be solved when survival demands it. That scientific rigor and engineering excellence and industrial capacity, properly integrated, can create capabilities that change the strategic balance. That America's greatest strength has never been superior numbers or geographic advantage or natural resources, though all those matter. America's greatest strength has always been the ability to identify critical problems, marshal intellectual and industrial resources, and create solutions faster than adversaries can adapt. That's what won World War II, not proximity fuses alone, or radar, or code breaking, or atomic bombs, or any single technology. What won was a system that could develop proximity fuses and radar and code breaking and atomic bombs simultaneously, produce them at scale, deploy them effectively, and do it all while fighting a two-ocean war against enemies who'd been preparing for decades. The men aboard the Hugh W. Hadley didn't know they were part of that system. They were too busy loading shells and firing guns and fighting fires to think about strategic implications. But they benefited from it. Every shell they fired contained the work of scientists who'd solved impossible problems. Every aircraft they shot down validated the decisions of military leaders who'd bet billions of dollars on technologies that might not work. Every minute they survived proved that their American innovation, properly applied, could defeat any threat. That's the real story of the proximity fuse. Not the engineering details or the battle statistics or even the ships saved and lives preserved. The real story is about what happens when a nation decides that failure isn't acceptable and impossible isn't an obstacle. About what Americans can accomplish when survival depends on being better, faster, and smarter than everyone else. The Hugh W. Hadley's crew didn't save themselves. They were saved by decisions made years earlier in Washington laboratories and factory boardrooms and congressional appropriations committees. By people who understood that wars are won before the shooting starts, by investments in science and manufacturing and education that create options when options matter most. On May 11th, 1945, those investments paid dividends measured in lives saved and ships preserved and strategic capabilities maintained. Commander Mullaney stood on his bridge watching kamikazes fall from the sky, each one destroyed by a weapon that shouldn't have existed. His ship was dying beneath his feet, but he and most of his crew would survive to fight another day. That survival wasn't luck. It was American ingenuity, mass-produced and delivered at exactly the moment when it mattered most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.